Putin and Kim announced they signed a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty, and Putin called it a breakthrough document. As we start to see some details come out, do you see it that way? Is it a big deal?
It is important and negative. I think it is both those things, but it's not a fundamental change in the nature of relations of major states. It isn't good news in terms of what the North Koreans have been supplying the Russians so that they can more effectively prosecute their invasion and war against Ukraine. That's not good news. And on the other hand, we can't be really sure what it is exactly the Russians are going to transfer to the North Koreans.
Yeah, let's break down the significant parts of what we do know, starting with what Putin called military technical cooperation. Do you think that is a concerning development, the announcement of that? And what could it mean as far as Pyongyang's nuclear weapons capability? What could they transfer?
The key issue is, will the Russians materially assist the North Koreans in having a more effective, more threatening nuclear weapons capability? And by that, I mean not only the weapons themselves, will they be thermonuclear weapons assistance as opposed to simple fission weapons? Will, in other words, the yield go up? Will the confidence that the North Koreans have in their weapons go up thanks to Russian assistance? Will the delivery vehicles, the ballistic missiles, particularly the intercontinental ballistic missiles, that have for a long time been real questions about whether the North should have any confidence in their ICBMs, their ability to deliver nuclear weapons against continental United States, given that they can't be sure that the warheads containing these nuclear weapons would actually survive the trip and reentry and work effectively. And it's not clear at all when, in what we understand will be the language of this, if it's when and if it's released, that the Russians are committing to make these kinds of transfers.
I assume those would be violations of international law and sanctions. Both countries have been under varying sanctions, especially North Korea. And if you believe U.S. officials, both are already violating these sanctions through these arms and ammunition transfers to do with Ukraine. You have engaged in high-level diplomacy with North Korea in the past. What can and should be done now by the Biden administration?
We should deplore what the Russian move signals, and that is, first, no longer a willingness on the part of the Russians to see the direction of events to lead to an eventual denuclearization of the peninsula. In other words, the Russians had been aboard with the Chinese and the rest of the world at sanctioning, UN sanctions, sanctioning the North Koreans for their ballistic missile and nuclear weapons development. I think this, if it does nothing else, signals the Russians are no longer aboard, and that ought to be deplored and ought to be criticized.
You said it was bad news. Is it also bad news that part of this agreement includes a mutual defense pact?
I do not know what it means. I certainly, even if I had the text in front of me, and nobody does, as I understand it, it's hard to tell. I mean, when the Russians make a deal, and they have been clear, they don't call it an alliance. The North called it an alliance, but not the Russians. I mean, the last time the Russians made a security commitment that I know of like this was 1994 in the Budapest Memorandum, when they promised that they would not threaten Ukraine's security. Well, we all know what that was worth. We all ought to remember nothing has changed here, really. The North has been providing this military aid to the Russians. The Russians are still pursuing their invasion of Ukraine. We have talked about the one thing that might be important and different, and that is if the Russians started supplying technical assistance to the weapons of mass destruction and delivery vehicles that the North Koreans have been developing for the last 25 years.
Robert Gallucci, thank you so much for joining us with your analysis. Appreciate it.
Thank you much.